let's do it. Let's see.
Hi, thanks a lot. This is actually a question for Dr. Mumper. My name is Zishan. My question was about the chromosome deletion that's, you're probably aware of that, that's been related to autistic symptoms. And it's related because not everyone who has this chromosome deletion has any autistic issues or has any medical issues. My question to you is, do you know if there have been any studies done for people who have this chromosome deletion and what effect, when taking vaccination, what affects them who have this chromosome deletion? Like, have there been any objective studies on this?
So there are at least 3 chromosomes that have been widely reported to be associated with some autistic type syndromes. The chromosome 15 is one, chromosome 11 is another, and chromosome 5 is another. So I'm sure we'll find others that have associations. So it kind of depends on which of those deletions a particular child has, what the clinical manifestations are. No, to my knowledge, I do not know of any studies. You ask about the effect of a deleted chromosome on vaccination status, whether or not kids should be vaccinated, how well they're going to do with vaccination.
Yeah, my question was, like, for people who have this chromosome deletion, have there been any objective studies as to if that child is vaccinated, what effect it would do with a person who has this chromosome deletion? Because it would make sense if, for example, if this is related, right? So it just makes sense, okay, well, you test them for this chromosome deletion, see if they have it, and then see if, an objective study would make sense to see if certain vaccinations would cause certain problems because they're related to people having autistic symptoms or any development delay issues.
So there are a couple of thoughts that I have. One is that chromosome deletions are relatively rare, and one of the issues with looking for vaccine reactions in a population is that you theoretically would need a pretty big population to study, which might be difficult to recruit with a particular chromosomal deletion. So I think that knowing the deletion might be very helpful in determining certain characteristics that you might be able to pre-plan for in terms of doing proactive treatment strategies. But I think I've been struggling for the whole time I've been in this world to get vaccine studies just on everybody, and it's incredibly difficult to get that work funded in ways that we would feel that would be adequate to answer the questions. The other response I would have is that our genetic heritage is very, very rich, and so how many chromosomes you have and which ones are deleted is part of that. The other huge part of it is this issue of single nucleotide polymorphisms and the many, many millions of those that we know exist, and I feel quite sure that there's probably a lot that we don't know about. So there's this very rich communication between not just what your chromosomes are saying, but what your various single nucleotide polymorphisms are saying to your body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but it's just too bad there haven't been.
It is totally
because
too.
It seems that this is a missing link. Because if you look at it logically, so okay, so chromosome deletion is.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'm so sorry. We have a lot of people with some questions. We do have a question over here that has a dietary, I guess, topic to it.
Carissa was talking about reducing grains, and I think Sonia as well. Is there any concern about rice milk? And so that's part one of my question. Part two is just about soy. I'm being told organic soy is okay, but I know there's an issue with some people. It's an issue with soy in general.
For us, we really find that the body gets better when kids are grain-free. There has been arsenic found in rice, and although arsenic doesn't bioaccumulate, it can impact SNP, so we generally won't go to rice as a dairy-free option, and we don't love soy. But if your choice for me is between soy and dairy, then we generally go soy as long as it's organic. But yeah, soy has its own concerns, and it has enzyme impairments the same way that casein and gluten do. Yes. Yeah. We say any non-dairy milk other than, rice and soy is probably okay, but no carrageenan. I mean, Dr. Russell Blaylock does a nice talk. You can get it on YouTube. It's called Taste That Kill. And he's like Chris, he'll scare the pants off you with excitotoxins. And so carrageenan is in the no-no list. For us, yeah. I mean, ideally, we use the non-dairy milks as a transition, and then we try to get kids on water, right? Get hooked on water.
What's the hormones in the soy?
It's really, really fast and easy to make seed and nut milks. If you just soak about a quarter cup of seeds or nuts with about a cup of water overnight and then blend it in the morning, works like a charm. So if you're looking to transition, you get very nutrient dense food that way. Just get organic nuts or seeds. Okay, you can do it with sunflower seeds. Pumpkin seeds have a little bit of a funny color and flavor. You can do it with flax seeds.
I think sunflower milk now. I agree. I think it's ideal to get and make it yourself. It's sort of like the reverse gateway drug. We go from dairy to a non-dairy milk, and then hopefully making your own. It's such a process and a transition, right?
We have a question over here.
Hi, when my son was born, he had seizures, and when he was admitted to the hospital for his seizures, he was put on phenobarbital, which he took for 1 full year of his life. And during that year, we knew his development wasn't quite right, but we kind of attributed it to the phenobarbital because it's a barbiturate. But later we discovered that he had autism at about 2.5. And then soon after that, we did a chromosome test and then learned that he had not a deletion, but a duplication of number 15. So my question is, aside from the genetic factors, and I know that that's one of the chromosomes that does predispose you to ASD, I'm curious about the phenobarbital and the talk that you gave this morning regarding toxins and all that other good stuff.
So a couple of thoughts that I have. One is that since your child did have a seizure very early on and also had a chromosomal duplication, they kind of fall into the category of being a case of autism that's more genetically determined around birth and with very early manifestations, as opposed to another subset of kids who tend to present a little bit later on and probably have more of a later environmental component. So there's several ways, many ways you can subgroup autism, but that's kind of one way. Unfortunately, we do know that phenobarbital, which is very good to stop seizures, is also associated with some cognitive slowing and some of the developmental delays that you noticed during that time that he was on it. Unfortunately, we also know that, especially in the early onset kids, that coexisting seizures are a big part of the picture. And if we look with very, very sophisticated monitoring devices and look at all comers and look for any EEG abnormalities, we know that as many as 85% of kids in the autism spectrum in some studies will show some EEG abnormalities. So we very quickly get into a rock and a hard place situation, because on the one hand, you need to treat seizures. On the other hand, none of us can name a seizure drug that we love completely because they all come with a set of side effects. I think that the concern is that repeated seizures at a young age are not a good thing either. In terms of phenobarbital itself being implicated as in the genesis of autism, it is not one of the ones to my knowledge that has been implicated, but valproate, which is another type of anti-seizure medication, has been implicated as one of the medications that has been associated with autism. So I think given the set of cards you had to play, your docs were probably trying to do the best thing, and it seems like it was a reasonable thing to do.
We have another question over here.
I know Dr. Fink had left, but she had talked about C-sections and you'd be missing reflexes if your child was born by a C-section. excuse me. And then also I noticed in one of your slides, Dr. Doherty, Sonia, that it was to do with colostridia. I'm probably saying that wrong. And there was something about C-section, but you kind of just went past really quickly. So I guess my question is around C-sections. What is your view on C-section? And
I mean, they're life-saving, right? I think we can't sit in the room with healthcare providers and people who've had C-sections. C-sections can be life-saving. I think one of the concerns is that we don't have maternal-child focused care, and we're a little too worried about when the OB has to go off and home and he needs to. So, the idea of midwifery care in some ways where it's the baby comes when the baby comes would probably prevent unnecessary C-sections. I think we need to C-section as emergencies only. Now, emergency C-sections are linked to increased diagnosis of developmental concern, but again, that's a sort of like chicken and egg. Is the C-section required because of a concern with the baby that's already pre-existing, or is the C-section itself contributing to the developmental delay? In terms of gut, I mean, the gut has hundreds of trillions of bacteria, right? So I think we've heard 10, we've heard 100, but I don't know if they're still studying it, but the gut is 100% responsible for postnatal development. So the problem with C-section is you miss the vaginal tract that plants the good flora that allows that balance in the digestive tract that's so crucial. And then the Clostridia species have the opportunity to grow over, right, like bullies. And then when they do, they can create disruption.
We have another question over here.
Hi, I'm wondering about enemas and hydrocolonics. Since we're talking about constipation and kids who've been chronically constipated, and whether it could be done safely, and what would you recommend?
I know, let's take that one. I don't do colonics in my practice. I don't recommend them. I'm not sure if I'm there yet or I need to take a different course. I know my sister just took an environmental medicine. Recommend enemas. I think you have to be very careful, right? We don't want to just start giving enemas to kids.
That said, as a child, that was one of the things that my parents did with me in an attempt to deal with some of my digestive problems, and it did seem to bring temporary relief. That's all I've ever had from it. As an adult, it has been profoundly helpful as a detox support, but again, temporary relief. It just seems to deal with inflammation, pain in the extremities, inflammation in the brain, but in a very temporary way, and you can lose a lot of money fast doing that.
What's your thought? I'm just curious for my own learning.
I do sometimes recommend enemas. Lynchburg, Virginia is the capital of the world for enemas. Fleet's Enemas is my little city. And so that's typically what I would use is just a little over-the-counter enema that's just, 8 or 12 ounces. I do not know enough about colonics to be able to recommend them, although I do have some patients who have tried them and found that the clean out is amazing. I will tell you that early on in this work, in 2002, 2003, we were doing some gut biopsy studies, and in order for that to happen, we had to really clean out the kids well. So we gave them a combination of max citrate and some other things that the radiologists recommend to really clear out their GI tract, and then they had a whole day where they were not allowed to eat. And the parents would always look at me when I explained this as if I were crazy, and they were like, how will I get my child not to eat, and how will I be able to only have them drink this horrible stuff? And they almost inevitably came back and said, that was one of the best days that I ever had with my child. He was more alive, he was more alert, he was more interactive, he talked more. I wish I could clean him out, every day. So I do think that these gut bugs that we have profound effects on us, and that just a nice clean out is very helpful. Now I'm going to blow your mind for a minute, because one thing I'm really interested in is actually fecal transplants. There's a guy in Sydney, Australia named Tom Barodi, who is the pioneer in this. He has actually totally reversed inflammatory bowel disease in some patients by giving them fecal transplants. And so They are working on ways, as opposed to putting somebody else's poop in through your butt, to actually desiccate it and have you swallow it. I think that this is going to be the next huge frontier, and that we're going to see huge, dramatic improvements when that technology is perfected.
We have another question over here.
Well, I have two comments. One, to people who have children who have seizures. My daughter's 38, and she started having seizures as a teenager and was put on Tegretol, which was terrible. She took it for 11 years. It didn't control the seizures very well. There's a long story behind this, but the short answer is she does not take anything. For years, she's had hardly a single seizure. She's been taking supplements that we were recommended by naturopaths, and they work better than the seizure medication. And it was pretty scary going off it when a doctor stares you in the eye and says, your daughter could die if you take her off this seizure medication, and yet it wasn't working. So that's a good thing about going to a naturopath, believe me. The second thing is, and I'm sure Sonia and Chris are kind of like, oh no, not her again. I am really upset about fluoride in the water. When you want to drink water, you better drink it without fluoride, and try and get to your counselors here in Halton and tell them, get this stuff out. It is coming out of cities across Canada and the United States monthly. And it's bad stuff. It binds with aluminum, which makes the aluminum cross the blood-brain barrier. It's bad for people with autism. It's bad for everybody. But it's also bad for intestines because it actually does affect the villi of the intestines in terms of making them sort of shrink down. And about 1% of the population is very, very allergic to it or sensitive to it.
Are there any dentists here today? Okay, good, I can say no.
There are lots of dentists here.
I had a conversation with a lovely dentist the other day, and because it's not my area of expertise, so that's why I was asking if someone was here. But is it recommended by dentists to have the fluoride in the water? Because when I was speaking with this dentist, they said, like topically and in the mouth can be very helpful, but it's not in the water systemically. Yeah, I'm just wondering.
We actually have a dentist here.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because
I want to clarify that both of us are dentists, but not practicing here in Canada. So we're a little away from our practice for 10 years. But basically, topically, it is recommended in water, and there's a dosage, a recommended level in the water, minimum level that changes per country according to temperature and water consumption. If it's very hot, it has to be a much lower dosage in the water than in colder climates, of course. I've kind of been always pro water fluoridation because I come from a country like Canada. There's no good dental public health preventative system. So it is a major source of caries prevention, or I'm going to say a big public health measure through history, right? The dental benefits of it. Now, as I say that in ignorance of all of what you guys know about fluoride and development, right? Neurological development. So of course, as a dentist, I'm going to have to say that I'm probably in a country where there's no public health prevention, fluoride in water at adequate levels of what I read, dentally is beneficial. Now, I can't.
Right, let me ask my toxin experts here and see what their thoughts are. I don't know who wants to. Dr. Mark, you have
I'm just going to go by the course that I just took, and I'm going to not take personal opinion, but so again, this course that I took with Walter Crinian, I think he's fantastic, and he thinks we're so backward up here. The first thing he said when he was the first line he said when he opened the course, you folks still have fluoride in your water up here? I felt so backward, because I think where he's from, the city that he's from, they have actually pulled it out. I think it's pulled out in Portland, Oregon. It is being pulled out all over the place. So yeah, so I do feel that at this point it isn't necessary. It has huge health issues. So I mean, So, yeah, I'm anti-thyroid, or anti-thyroid.
We have another one over here.
Hi. Actually, we came up from a little bit up north. We're coming from Barrie. I read about, actually a colleague piqued my interest about this conference. I have a 3-year-old son who's autistic. But when I was reading online, I came across your work with Methyl B12. Coming from Northern Ontario, I'm wondering how, as a parent, could I get like access to it, like methyl B12 injections? Because when I was looking online, I'm seeing kids getting them done, and it's like no problem.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of injecting a child is a big deal. So we're usually talking to parents about, that we use a very small syringe. It's an insulin syringe. We do a subcutaneous injection in the bum, and we actually teach parents to do it at home. So, methyl B12 is extremely safe. It's water soluble, it's non-toxic. You do have to be taking folate or methylfolate or folinic acid and a B complex with it, but we consider it to be a highly successful intervention. So any naturopathic doctor can prescribe methyl B12. It's a huge part of my biomedical treatment, and it's something that I learned through my DAN training and my MAPS training. So it's the one thing that I will just put it as an adjunct is that a lot of parents find methyl B12 and because the response rate is really, really good, they get excited about it, which I think they should. It gives you a burst of really nice development. It will help. I think Dr. A had a wonderful chart where it showed the developmental curve increasing, and so we'll do that for most kids. It has to be combined with diet. So that methylation wheel, if your glutathione is deficient, gluten and dairy stop the production of glutathione. So if you're trying to produce glutathione through methyl B12 injections, but you're not on the diet, I don't think you get the same benefit. And I think that's what's happening with the clinical trials, is that there was one and it didn't show benefit, and I almost fell out of my chair. So I think it has to be with combined treatment.
Through the mail. She sends it through the mail.
She was asking questions.
We have a lot of folks from Barrie's a bit of a hotbed for us. It's like my lucky coin from Barrie. For patients, we send it through the mail.
Hi, we have another question here.
Actually, I don't have a question. I'd like to share my experience with the injection. My son has it, and Dr. Sonia prescribed him the B12. It's a very easy procedure. It's maybe scary for the first time, but he's on that for quite a while, and right now we can tell if he needs the injection because of his behavior. So when we inject him, he comes pretty fast, and in the terms of few days, we know when we have to do it again. It's very effective.
Thank you. I agree. My son, we call them bum shots. He calls it bum shot, and he's actually at the point where he'll pick which butt cheek he wants his bum shot in. He's like, it's really quite painless, and the developmental improvements that we saw, and that we see if he is lagging and taking his bum shot, it's remarkable. So it does make a big difference.
And I'll speak with, but my mom's a trained physiotherapist, and she's been working for a long time in that field, and we started having some sensory issues with our son. It just looked like behavior, so we had no idea what was going on. For some parents, never slept, gut issues, so we were just playing catch up. And so he's having 1 hour meltdowns, and couldn't go to the grocery store, couldn't go to the park, freak out to try and put his shoes on, socks on, all that stuff. And so my mom thought, well, why don't you inject him with B12? And that shifted my paradigm. I said, well, I don't think he's on the spectrum. She said, what's the difference? Development's development. And I did. I started trying B12 injections for my really tough ADHD cases, and started getting phenomenal response, and for my Tourette's cases and OCD, and Chris works with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and so it's a wonderful therapy for more than just autism. Yeah.
Fix the diet.
Gluten and dairy are poison. I mean, I know that it's very difficult, but that's why. That's why we love having Jackie here and some of the kids speak, because Dr. Buckley last year said, heart is seizures, heart is mucus in the stool, and pain in the bowel. The diet's not hard. The diet's not hard compared to what it can do for most people.
And just so you know, when I'm talking about networking with adults in the spectrum, I'm talking networking with ADHD, OCD, Tourette's, ADHD, PDD, and NOS. I mean, the spectrum is alphabet soup. But essentially, it's the same list of challenges that are in different patterns. Some of them are present for some and not for others, and to different degrees and intensities. But basically, it's a very, very similar mix for all of us, and the same things make life better for all of us.
Very well put. We have another question over here.
Hi, Dr. Sonia.
How are you?
Good, how are you? I remember your talk at TCM about the ADHD as well.
Yeah.
And kind of, similar stuff, so this is great. Just a question for you. Do you know or have an idea of the mechanism of action for how gluten and dairy actually can impact methylation pathways a little bit?
I think so. I mean, I have to say, I woke up in the middle of the night last night with tons of nerves, and you know, speaking when your mentor or someone you hope to mentor with and someone you have learned from is speaking can be a little tough. So I answer these questions and kind of look over at Dr. Mumpin and say, am I doing well from your trade out? We're having a whole bottle tonight. So I really feel like it's multifactorial. One is that gluten and dairy and what has happened to them. So dairy, predominantly in North America, is A1 beta casein. So that form of protein is extremely inflammatory. So the methylation cycle, part of its job is to regulate and get rid of inflammation by pumping it out through glutathione and the detoxification pathways. So the other way is that gluten and dairy inhibit the production of glutathione. So you get a log jam. And then if you have damage in the gut, and you get inflammation in the gut, you open up the gut to leak the gut, then you get more systemic inflammation, you put more pressure on the methylation pathway. So these are people who have methylation impairments, and then they have gut issues, and then they have toxicity. And so it's just this whole system can grind to a halt. So.
We have another question over here. Oh, sorry.
I'll just add one thing about that. I didn't go into this with the biochemistry today, but there's a subset of people that have problems with adenosine deaminase, and in the methylation pathway, gluten and casein can be very difficult for that subset to metabolize. And so when that happens by a process that's called negative feedback, as the adenosine is impaired, it increases something called S-adenosyl homocysteine, which essentially, the only reason to know that is it blocks everything. And so, you've got this clock that's supposed to be waxing on while the folate waxes off, and all of a sudden there's a cog in the wheel and it stops everything up. So there are really multiple reasons that gluten and casein is a problem. One has to do with the pro-inflammatory nature, the difficulty handling the cow's milk protein. Another has to do with a subset of kids who are truly allergic to it, but a bigger subset are the ones that just cannot metabolize it. Then there's a subset that probably could metabolize it if we didn't have all these preservatives in our foods that are poisoning the enzymes that they ought to be using to metabolize it. And then there's a bigger sort of teleologic evolutionary biology reason, which is that grain is a very recent addition to the human diet. And it's only been around for, I think, 1,800 years, which in the context of human evolution is a blink of an eye. And so we just haven't really had time to get everybody up to speed to be able to handle it in the first place. So I think there are lots of good reasons that it's not good.
Thank you. We have one more question here.
Just a quick comment before my question about fluoride, which might be a better source of information. Dr. Lineback is one of the main researchers at the University of Toronto regarding fluoridation, and he was a very pro-fluoride. I think he pushed it a lot, and now he's one of the main opposers of fluoridating water. So he might be a better source for you guys to get information on that. And then our question is, we have a son which we know has been different since he was small, and we've been through more than a year of trying to get help, and finally got to the pediatrician, and he's been diagnosed after a questionnaire with ADHD, and then we were shown the medications we can give him, and that's what we have now in our head for a year, and we're glad to hear all this information. We were very, didn't know about all this about gluten and stuff, but I just wondered, where do we go now? Do we need to get a psych assessment for our son? We don't have benefits, or we'll, find the money to do whatever we need to do, but do we go to your office, to your Dr. Doherty's office? Do we get a psych assessment? Where do we start?
I'll make a quick comment and then I'll turn it over to you. So I will say something about fluoride, which is that I highly recommend a book, and I can't remember the name of it, but it has a yellow cover with a little girl with a dress on front. It talks about the history. What's the name of it?
That's by Christopher Bryson, and it's called...
Christopher Bryson.
Bryson, oh gosh, now, get out of my mind. There's two books. There's one called The Case Against Fluoride, which is a 2010 book, and then the one, it's all about the history of fluoride.
Exactly.
The author is
Christopher Bryson, that is correct. And the issue there is that essentially fluoride was originally developed as part of the World War II chemical warfare division of things, and then they had all this fluoride and they decided not to use it for that, so they put it in the drinking water. That's the Cliff Notes version, and there's a lot more nuance to it. But it's very sobering to look at the history of how things end up. With regards to your ADHD, I personally would recommend a very natural approach to it. So many of the things that the naturopaths can do for autism also work extremely well for ADHD. ADHD is often characterized by sort of a neuroexcitatory kind of frame of mind. And my bias, even though I do have prescriptive authority, is that I really would prefer not to write for stimulants on kids with ADHD if I can get them better with some combination of diet, avoiding preservatives, avoiding additives, magnesium, taurine, healing the gut. I mean, the list goes on and on. I would, in the States, I would be able to say this. I won't disperse, I don't want to make disparaging remarks about Canada, but I do think if you go to a psychiatrist, what's in their bag of tricks is a prescription for a stimulant. So, yeah.
I also have a couple of comments on that. I do, as a clinical psychologist, I do assessments and diagnosis, and I quite often hear from parents where they'll say, oh, I went to an appointment and I filled out a questionnaire and talked to the doctor for 5 minutes and they diagnosed ADHD. And I say, they didn't do it properly. Maybe they threw out that diagnosis, but you cannot properly assess a child with a questionnaire and a 5-minute interview. To properly even assess whether or not ADHD is actually an issue, you have to get a history, you have to understand what's happening at home and at school. It even says in the DSM that you have to have information across multiple environments. You have to do a whole workup. So I have quite a lot of parents that really would pursue a fuller diagnosis, perhaps with a psychologist or a pediatric developmental pediatrician, perhaps. And then if they do have ADHD, then what I often say is that doesn't necessarily mean, in any sense, that you need a prescription for a stimulant medication. I typically recommend that the first approach would be talking to a naturopath and looking at a more natural solution, because if you can do that, then that's good. And even if you do decide that your child might benefit from a stimulant, because I have seen some kids, in some cases, that get an amazing benefit from a stimulant, that's what they need for them. I always say there should be a medication trial. It should not just be, here's a prescription for 3 months, see if it works. It's very subjective. How do you know one day to the next if it's working? And how are you getting an opinion from school? It's very easy to coordinate a medication trial with a pharmacy if you decide you tried naturopath, where you get 4 bottles of pills, they all look the same. 2 weeks are stimulant medications, 2 weeks are sugar pills. You don't know which is which. At the end of every week, you fill out a questionnaire, the teacher fills out a questionnaire, at the end you reveal what is what, and then you can actually have at least some solid data about is this effective or not. Because if you're putting your child on a stimulant, which has all sorts of potential side effects, you better know, at least I would want to know as a parent, that I've tried natural solutions first, and that if I do have them on it, that it is making a really significant improvement. Because if it is, then I've seen some kids that benefit wonderfully, but if it's not, then it's certainly not something that should be easily turned to.
If you're looking for a good place to start, there's a couple called Reichenberg Ullman, REICHENBERG-ULLMAN, and the two of them have written a book called Ritalin-Free Kids. They are both naturopathic doctors, and the book is old but still a gem. There are a lot of natural medicine options, and first and foremost, if there's anything that you've gathered from the presentations here today, I hope it is that our chemistry is already very far off. And when you add new chemistry to our chemistry, you get very unpredictable and often lots of side effects. So the more that you can support the body in doing its own repairs using natural medicines, the better off you are. And that's just a starting place to give you some perspective on what options you've got.
Something great to walk away with.
So I have a very quick comment on ADHD, just because as an adult I was identified as being in that category, which I'm sure doesn't shock anyone. But the neat thing is that I have people who were at school with me, and they can tell you is that until I started working on my diet and myself, I literally couldn't sit in class. So I went through my postgrad, and there were people in my class that didn't even know who I was. So, and that was as an adult, and through my whole childhood I would have had those concerns, and nothing would have changed it except had I gone on the same journey. And so I pay tribute to the families that are working with kids with autism, because what I've learned from myself and from my children and for my mom and my sister and my nieces has been really phenomenal. We do have a lovely video from the conference last year of Katie and Michael. So Michael, I'll tell a very quick story. Michael is talking about his biomedical treatment, and he's saying how great it was that his mom took out gluten and dairy and giving him these bum shots. And he's playing with the buddy, and the friend says, like, dude, why don't you just eat some pizza? And he's like, because if I ate pizza, then I would want to punch you in the face. And walk and eat pizza, and I can't eat it. So it was really cute. And so that video should be on our website in the fall. It's loading up, which our conference stuff will be on the website soon. As soon as we can get it off our webcast, we can get the videos. But that was a wonderful story. But and he says, he actually, in her blog, which is Katie Gagan, The Open Secret, he says, I don't know what I'm going to do when my mom dies, who's going to cook the food that keeps me healthy, and who's going to give me my bum shot. So this reality is amazing.
We have a question over here.
I was wondering, when you talk about casein, I'm not too familiar with this. Is it only cow's milk, or is it goat milk, or is it any kind of milk that comes from an animal?
Yeah, the difference is that cow's milk in North America has A1 beta casein, and that particular protein has been linked to making autism behaviors worse, to making ADHD behaviors worse. It's linked to inflammatory concerns like arthritis and heart disease. Dr. Esselstyn, who's a cardiologist, spoke at one of our naturopathic conferences recently, and he told us that in the research labs they actually use beta casein to reduce heart disease, so that then they can find a drug to treat heart disease. And so he said, I'm a heart surgeon, so I couldn't, I could no longer just cut people up at the end of their lives to try to save them. I started, so he put in his diet, and he has a 100% success rate. They made a movie out of it, Forks Over Knives, and there's a book called The China Study, and that's all through diet, which is not exactly what we're talking about, but still very powerful food story.
I think we had a question over here. Yes,
Hi. This question's for either you, Sonia, or Dr. Mackler. For families coming in for treatment, I can imagine that it can be financially stressful for them. And I'm just wondering, I know you don't want to cut corners, but in terms of testing, what would you strongly recommend, and what would you maybe use supplementation and diet as a trial for?
I think everyone's a bit different here. I mean, the nice thing about working with your medical doctor is we can get some testing run through OHIP, and then it is covered. I like to see if Clostridia is there. I like the comprehensive organic acid test, the comprehensive digestive stool analysis. I'd like to get metal testing whenever possible. So those are the big ones. Now that we can get some of the SNP testing a little bit less expensive, we like to see those single nucleoside polymorphisms in as many kids as possible. So I think you can find out a lot through treatment, but you can waste a lot of time and energy if you don't have enough testing. You don't know what beast you're trying to go after. So, but
I mean, my situation in the States is very different in that we have a different insurance structure, and there are labs that are usually covered by most insurances, and then there are the functional labs that I really like information from that are typically not covered by classic insurance, but a lot of the functional labs have worked out a deal where they'll bill the parents $169 for a theoretic $2,000 test and then agree not to come after the parents for the balance if their insurance company doesn't cover it. So in America, we're masters at cost shifting, which means we charge people that have the means to pay for it or better insurance plans enough to cover the people that don't have the coverage, and it's all very probably unethical. And there's this big thing about Chargemaster that was written up in Time magazine about how the hospitals inflate their prices and charge people, you know, $800 even though they know they're only going to get $69 back from the insurance company, but then if somebody doesn't have insurance, they have to pay the $800. It's all a horrible system, so I don't recommend it.
I think we have one last question, and then we're going to move on to our door prizes.
Hi, I just have a question. If you were to start one thing in a very big, busy family, what would you recommend? Gluten-free or dairy-free?
I would love to answer this question. I don't know if anyone else is jumping at the bit, but I would wonder why, after all these amazing presentations that you
Poor boys.
I
imagine giving teenagers that don't want to give up bread, but I too with autism.
I tell parents, imagine that I have just told you your child has a fatal peanut allergy. And I have a very good friend and her child got diagnosed with peanut allergy, and she showed up the next day with 20 Tetra Packs of almond milk. So he's not even allergic to almonds, but it's in the realm of her fear zone. So we're very much, these are poisons. You take them out, people are going to feel better. And if you treat it like a poison, it leaves the home for everyone. But to answer your question more directly, generally we say pull out dairy first and then gluten. Thank you for indulging my soapbox.
There's some great muffin recipes and bread recipes in Elaine Gottschall's Breaking the Vicious Cycle. And there's some really good websites online for GAPS-friendly or SCB-friendly bread, which is basically as good as it gets for starving the wrong gut bugs.
And Lizanne is incredible.
Thank you. So yeah, Lizanne is our food coach, and as patients at the National Care Clinic, we provide you with her services so that you can help transition to diets because they're so expensive. So on a personal note, if you were here last year, you know at the very end of my presentation, I put up a picture of my son, Magnus, and no, I'm not crying. I'll cry at the end, but Magnus didn't really do well with the surgery that he had right after the conference last year. And the first person that I talked to was Lizanne, and I said, we have to go grain-free. How can we do it?
Just on a very quick note too, I take in kids, just to answer your question specifically, how do I do it with older kids? I have 4 kids. Just so you know, I take in kids after school. So I have 6 kids that are between the ages of 10 and 7. And 4 out of these 6 kids are a typical North American diet where they go to McDonald's, they go to Subway, they have Bear Paws as their nutritional snack in their lunch. So I get it, but that's not what they get at my house. And when they come over and they taste like the things that I make, I give them strawberries when they're in season. I give them cherries when they're in season, or sugar snap peas. I bake cinnamon bun muffins that are made with almond flour and sweetened with honey. There's no refined sugar, it is all grain-free, and I'm not making this up. They say, this is the best tasting thing I've ever had, can you give my mom the recipe? So I'm here to tell you it's doable, and the recipes are not, they don't require rocket science, they're doable, they're fantastic, and kids that go to McDonald's love them.
It's true, and we went grain-free, and our whole house was gluten-free, dairy-free, and we started making grain-free bread, and I had to take it and hide it from my other 2 kids. And then I thought, well, this is crazy, we should just be cooking grain-free bread for everyone. But if you asked me 5 years ago if I would have baked bread, the morning before going to work, I would have told you you're crazy. I'd say, I'm a working mom, I've got kids, I'm exhausted, and all that's true. But when Magnus came out of his surgery, and he was covered in eczema and diarrhea and smashing his head on the ground, Lizanne was so lovely to share all of her recipes and you know, all the information we have found to help his brain. So it's hard, but it makes such a huge difference. You just commit to it. You do one thing and you commit to continue to do it more and more and more until your child or you or a loved one is feeling better.
It's all related, just a quick question before you do this. Is everybody gluten intolerant? Or are some people tolerant of it and they can eat the breads and without having problems?
I think the best book for that for me is Dr. William Davis's book, Wheat Belly. It's very easy to get. It's at Costco. He talks about how the gluten in North America has been Frankenstein. They said, you know, it'd be great if this was stickier and smaller. So they added chemicals in until it was stickier and smaller. And then they thought it was like, what the heck is this, right? It doesn't know what to do with it. So I would say that none of us have the capacity to break down the gluten that they now make in North America.
Okay, one more thing, sorry. I've heard that it's about 4 different blood tests or something to actually test for intolerance versus straight up celiac. Is it an easy answer, but what those tests are to do? Because I know for myself personally, if I'm tested and I come out and it shows me on paper I am intolerant, it'd be easier for me to actually go gluten-free than just say, let's do it to try it as a natural thing.
I agree, and I'll pass the mic to Dr. Mumper for the answer, but read the book. I think that pretend it's Drano, like pretend you have poison in your home.
So there are tests that are very, very good at determining celiac disease. There's a genetic predisposition test there. It's DQ2 and DQ8 testing. And if you have one of those, you're at a certain percent higher risk of celiac disease in the background population. If you have both of them, you're at even higher risk. Remember, the background rate of celiac disease now is 1 in 100. So if you're at, say, 25%, 25 times risk, that means your chances is 1 in 4 of actually getting an autoimmune inflammatory disease that's going to tear out your gut lining. So I'll put it in that kind of context for you. The other 2 blood tests that look for damage from celiac disease is tissue transglutaminase and anti-endomysial antibodies. Now, there's some other tests that will look for gliadin antibodies, and so you'll be able to see if your body is making antibodies against the gliadin molecule. And so that would be considered that you are intolerant to it, but not having true celiac disease. However, that doesn't answer the bigger issue, which is this business of gluten as a pro-inflammatory molecule. And so you don't really have any test, in my estimation, that you can take in a lab that gives you free rein to have gluten and know that it's not hurting you on some level. Does that make sense?
From a practical standpoint, I know that in Ontario, the public health system won't pay for celiac testing. They consider it I forget the term, but basically a luxury test. So they will not pay for that. But you can go through your GP, get a prescription to one of the public labs and be tested, but they will only do the test, you have to pay for it, and they'll only do the test that looks for the specific genes. If you want to do the test to see if you have an intolerance, then you'll have to go through a naturopath clinic to get access to that test.